Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. So the formula that I've just recited in front of you, if you've not been in one of our classes, it means that we begin by praising Allah and we ask Him to bless the final messenger, Muhammad, and we send peace and salutations upon the final prophet. We begin with the prayer, a supplication, what's known as a dua, and that is Allahumma la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana, which means, oh Allah, we have no knowledge except what you've taught us, and you are the wise and you are the knowing, and Allah, teach us that which will benefit us and allow us to benefit from that which you've already taught us. Whenever we say the name of the Prophet, it's highly recommended to say sallallahu alaihi wasallam or alayhi salam, or peace and blessings be upon him, at least once in a gathering. It's mandatory according to many scholars, but it's highly recommended. So that's preliminary remarks, inshallah ta'ala. So this class is Prophetic Wisdom 1, and we're going to be covering a number of different topics in our class. We're going to be covering the teachings of the Prophet, and that means his statements, the things that he's saying, and we're going to try to extract wisdom from his sayings. We're going to talk about introduction to hadith. What does the word hadith actually mean? We're going to talk about some of the dangers in quoting these hadiths or these statements of his, and we're going to talk about methodology again. Like we've been doing in most of our classes, we're going to talk about methodology and how we select the statements that we're going to be using in our book that we've distributed already. So, the prophetic teachings. This class is going to focus on a number of selected reports about either statements made by the Prophet or descriptions about him or something like that. And there are many. There are many statements, and there are many things, many reports that exist, that are in existence. Now, one of the things we have to understand is that why are we studying these things? Why are we studying these statements? Why are we studying this wisdom? We're studying it because that the wisdom of a prophet, and when I say that the teachings, right, that's talking about his wisdom. The wisdom of a prophet is unlike the wisdom of any other human being. And today people study many things. They study wise words of philosophers like Buddhist and Confucius and Aristotle or whatever it may be. People study wise statements from politicians, wise statements from celebrities, wise statements from different things. And all of the different people that you could possibly study and you could possibly read about in your life, the one thing that differentiates a wisdom that's coming from a prophet and wisdom that's coming from any other human being is what? What is unique about it? Who can tell me? Raise your hand. Yes. It's from Allah. It's divinely inspired. So the difference is that when a prophet is saying something, or when a messenger of Allah has been chosen by Allah and they're saying something specific, when it's in relation to the religion, or even if it's in relation to some kind of character trait or whatever it may be, it is not something that people are trying to just simply figure out. It is not a statement that's just made haphazardly or made randomly, and it's not something that may just sound really nice. It's like a logical statement that kind of goes back and it kind of goes forward, and you're like, wow, that's so interesting. But then when you reflect upon it in detail, that's not very practical. Right? Like for example, it's attributed to Prophet Jesus, Prophet Isa alayhi salam. It says, you know what? If somebody hits you on one cheek, what should you do? Give them the other cheek and let them hit you on the other side. So in the beginning, the first time, if you think about it, whether or not you're taking it literally, but if you were to take it literally, it may seem like, wow, that's amazing. That's so generous. That's so nice, and that's merciful. And look at the care that the person has. But in terms of practicality, if you look at it again, you say, would we really take a statement like this literally? If he really made the statement, should we take something like this literally? It sounds nice, but no one would ever really do it. It's not something actually applicable. It's not something that you would put into practice. So therefore, the wisdom of a true prophet and the statement that's really attributed to him is something which is unique and something that other people do not possess. Because if a prophet were to make a statement in his capacity as a prophet, what would happen if the statement was incorrect or was wrong? It would be Allah's responsibility to correct that prophet, and He would do that. And that's something that we have to understand. So that's why we focus on prophetic teachings. And they're very important to understand, to learn from, to quote, to try to utilize for our benefit. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because some people think that we should focus more, or we should focus equally on statements of wisdom from other people because they sound nice. And we should go ahead and put it alongside the statement of a prophet and say, look, this is like universal wisdom. Wisdom that's coming from this person, wisdom that's coming from this person. There's a world of difference between that. There's a world of difference between what they call perennial wisdom, or there's a very new trend today, and saying that, you know what, this person has so much wisdom, this tradition, this faith, this understanding, this methodology, this philosophy has so much wisdom, and we can learn so many things from it. And it's just like the prophetic wisdom is something that just kind of goes into the basket as well. Those statements may be nice, they may have some good teachings in there and everything, but there's a world of difference because of the source, because of the purity and the authenticity and the greatness of the source in which this prophetic wisdom is actually coming from. Now what is this? When we talk about the statements of the Prophet and the teachings of the Prophet, we're talking about the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. The Quran has been given to us as a revelation. The Quran is a direct revelation that's coming from Allah to the Prophet. Now here's the thing. What is the role of the Prophet? What is his duty? What is his responsibility according to the Quran? Some people mistake it, some people understand it as if he is like a mailman. What does a mailman do? What is the mailman's job? When they receive a package or they receive an envelope or something, their job is to simply pass the package on to other people. They're not supposed to open it up. They're not supposed to read the letter. They're not supposed to interpret it. Or let's say an old style, those old style messengers that were sent by kings and emperors and all of that. Their job was to take the letter from the king and read it out loud. It was not to go and say, well, now let me explain to you the details about what the king actually meant. So the king was trying to say this and this and this. Generally, a messenger's job is not to do that. His job is to read the letter. And sometimes people think that's what the job of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, was as well. And they start taking the Quran and they say, I don't want to know what the Prophet had to say about this. I don't want to hear about what he says or what he hadith or all of these things. I'm going to take the Quran for how I want to take it. But if you look in the Quran, there are several verses which clarify and explain clearly that the Prophet's job was not only to convey the book itself, not only to recite it in front of you, but his job was also there to instruct you and teach you what it actually means. His job was there to interpret it for you. Now, how is his message interpreted for the most part? How is the Prophet's interpretations actually to be understood? If you go through a book on the statements of the Prophet, and we're going to talk about some of the books. If you go through a book on the statements of the Prophet, let's say Bukhari or any of them that happen to be there, you'll find a chapter within that book which says the Prophet's interpretations on certain verses of the Quran. And you will not find them consisting of even half or even a quarter of the verses of the Quran itself. What does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean that the Prophet did not interpret those verses? Does it mean that he did not give an explanation for those verses? No, that's not what it means. It means that he did not specifically quote and comment on those verses in one of his statements in particular. But his entire life and every one of the statements he made, which was in relation to the religion, every one of the teachings that he taught other people about smiling, about doing this, about acting in this way, about eating in this way, it was a commentary on the Quran. It was an explanation of the Quran, even though it was not explicit, it's an implicit explanation. And that's something very important to understand. Because when we understand that, we begin to contextualize or begin to understand how to contextualize the Quran in the first place. So that's why his role was that of a supplement to the Quran. That's why it's so important to study the statements and the teachings of the Prophet in addition to the Quran. Because he was sent not only with the message to convey it, he was sent like a supplement to go and supplement the Quran and give the other details. And oftentimes you will find in the Quran that certain things are not detailed. There's a framework is kind of given for you. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, he actually taught the details of these things. Now what does Allah say in the Quran regarding this? It says that the messenger of Allah is an excellent model for you to follow. Very simple. This is one of the verses out of many that talk about his teachings. It says the messenger of Allah is an excellent model for you to follow. What does that mean? Right? That means that his life and his statements and his teachings and the things that he did, all of these things are being given, a stamp of authority from on high by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The stamp is coming and saying that this is a person you should be following. This is not something that someone is coming and telling you and say, my advice is you should go ahead and follow this person. My advice is you should go to that mosque because it's the coolest mosque around and the people there are cool and everything like that. This is coming directly from Allah. So when you understand what this verse is actually trying to tell us, and the reference and everything is in your reading, it's in the books that you've been given. This is trying to tell you that you need to take his statements and his teachings very seriously. There's another verse which confirms his character and his behavior. It says, you, talking to the Prophet directly, you stand on an exalted standard of character. Now here's the thing. We live in a society where there's a lot of relativity in our morals. Right? Morals tend to change. What type of clothing was considered to be acceptable 20 years ago or 30 years ago has drastically changed today in society. What type of relationship or what type of people you would have a relationship with in public or in private or whatever it may be has changed to a drastic extent. It's changed quite a bit. Now if you look at the Quran is making absolute statements. And that's very important. The absolute statement it's making is that it's an excellent model. And in a relativistic society, who determines what's excellent? It's a question. Who determines what's excellent? Everyone. And whose statement counts if everyone determines and they differ? Who do you go with? Whoever's the most popular, perhaps. Or sometimes you may go with, we have to go democracy, we go with the majority. Or the people who are the most influential, not necessarily popular, but they have money and they can, funnel some, cash into these things. This is the kind of society that we live in. You have to make a decision in terms of what's being excellent. In Islam, we have absolute standards. And the word absolute scares a lot of people today. Let's say in postmodern, thought. It scares them. It's absolutism. Like everything is black and white. No, not necessarily. When you study Islam, you'll realize that things are much deeper. Things are much deeper than they seem. But at the same time, if you're talking about Allah and something that's coming from, teachings that are coming directly from Allah, when Allah intended something, it's absolute. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is absolute. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the perfect one. He knows how we think, He knows how we act, He knows everything, and He knows what's best for us. So these are things that we should take very seriously when it comes to the society. For non-Muslims, now here's the thing. Are prophetic teachings only for Muslims? Question. We got to know. Okay, with an explanation. Raise your hand. Are prophetic teachings only for non-Muslims? And explain. Yes. Okay. No, because everyone can benefit from good morals, from good conduct, from good behavior, from all of these things. Right. That's one aspect of it. What's the second aspect of it? There's a few answers I'm looking for. That's one of them. Is there another answer? Yes. Yes. Everyone's going to be judged with the same criteria. But you say, well, wait a minute. If someone's not a Muslim, why do they need to follow the teachings of the Prophet? They're not required to abstain from pork, or are they? There's actually a debate in theology, which we'll talk about in the theology class, whether or not they are required theoretically. But generally, you would say no. So why do they need to follow? What benefit are they going to get out of it? You wanted to say something? Okay. So depending on your deeds and your morals and everything, Allah may judge you differently even if you don't necessarily believe. There will be a level of difference in judgment. That's one thing. So you almost got the point that I'm looking for. There's one more aspect, yes. Okay, there's a universal standard, in a sense. Yes, it's set because it's set by Allah, so it's universal. Okay, that's what else? There's one more aspect, yeah. Okay, to correct misconceptions and to correct what is wrong, right? So perhaps in a society as well, people will benefit from good morals. But here's another thing, is that from our perspective, from our understanding, how do true Muslims, how do they choose Islam? Right? What makes someone choose Islam? It's not only the intellect. It's not some exercise of reason only that people choose Islam. It's because of the purity of their heart. And having good morals and having good character, and these teachings of the Prophet that relate particularly to character and becoming a good person, all of these things actually open up the heart, which will bring someone closer to Islam. So if you look at it from that perspective, we understand that, your character, your behavior, the purity of your heart is going to determine what you actually believe about Allah as well. Because if you have 100% sincerity and you're not tainted by other issues and other problems and other vices and all of these things, the Islamic belief is that you would have been led to Allah and you would have become Muslim. Okay, so the question is, you've met other people who are very pure and they've not, they're nice people and all of that. Well, what's causing them to choose other religions or something like that? From Islamic perspective, right, we're perceiving good in somebody, right? But we don't know exactly what's going to happen to them near the end of their life, number one. We don't know if they're going to choose Islam or not. Number two, Allah knows best what's in their heart. So our understanding or our thing is that if the truth has reached them, and if they're really pure, meaning not our conception, they're nice people, they help other people, they feed other people, but they're actually, they're not tainted by anything. They have like the perfect morals, perfect quality, clean heart. Not what the way we see, but completely clean heart in the sight of Allah. They would have accepted Allah. They would have accepted the Prophet. That's our understanding. And that's something that we have to differentiate between. Allah is going to judge, not us. We will judge someone as being really nice, and Allah may judge them differently. And we may judge someone as being a horrible person. Allah may judge them differently. So we should always differentiate between our judgment as acting in society and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's judgment, because He knows what's really inside the hearts of people. Okay, so so for non-Muslims, there's a sense of universal morals. And many people accept this feeling as well. Many people have an understanding that there are some good things in society, some good qualities to have, and there are some, bad qualities that we should refrain from. Some people don't have this, but many people do. So from that perspective, even non-Muslims are going to benefit. Like for example, the example given here is being good to your neighbors. Most societies have felt that this is a great quality, great characteristic. Being good to your guests, being nice to your parents, taking care of your parents, helping poor people. Unless you live in a very selfish, individualistic society which doesn't care about anyone else, and morals have become so relative that you don't care about anything else, generally there's a sense, kind of a sense of universalism to these things. Which will do what? It will purify people's hearts. It will benefit them perhaps to some extent be judged by Allah. And also in the society, it's going to affect the society. So if you look at it from this perspective, our society that we live in, is it in need, Muslims and non-Muslims both, are they in need of the teachings of the Prophet when it comes to rights of neighbors, rights of parents? We look at the family systems breaking down. People don't even know who their neighbors are. People don't even care who their neighbors are. Sometimes there's a neighbor one time, a professor, he died in his house. 1 week, they found him later, his body was completely decayed. Why? Because no one cared about this guy. The old guy living out there, no one even cared to ever look at him or think about what's going on or something like that. Just lived a life by himself. These morals and these etiquettes and these characteristics affect the society in which we live in. And it's going to have a drastic effect on the type of world in which we live in, the type of world that we want to raise our children in, the type of world that we would like to be in, rather than people going and just trying to rip each other off or trying to be very rude to one another. It makes a world of difference. Okay? So today, as I mentioned, today we have relative morals. It's become very, very common. Morals are relative. Individualism is very rampant. And marketing is actually promoting the idea that you only need to focus on yourself. And this becomes a major problem. When it's marketed to you, and then when it's even preached from, as I say, from the pulpits of universities, because the university is almost like the new church, all right? And I say this in try to understand what I'm saying by this. It's like the new church in the sense that it's the accepted authority. That if you research in this field or if you research in this way, this is going to be the expert in this field. You have to accept what they're saying. It's become a societal standard. You accept it. Now, if you're going and you're studying politics, and you decide that, you know what, one of the books that we study in politics is by Machiavelli. Anyone done political science, by the way? Anyone studied Machiavelli? Right? You understand what's being taught. There's a different philosophy being taught, and you say, well, it's interesting. There's some benefit to it, perhaps. It's interesting to research and all that. But if someone takes that type of approach, in the sense that we only focus primarily on ourselves. You can deceive, you can do this, you can do that, because it's for the sake of either the state, or for the sake of your people, or for the sake of national security, or for the sake of, nationalism or the nation or whatever it may be. Your morals are not clearly defined again. And now what do you have? You have a justification of so many things. Like there's debates. There's actually debates on whether we should target what is considered to be civilian casualties in drone strikes today. Most of you are familiar with the debate. The White House just released a memo justifying their position and saying we have no issue with it. It's perfectly fine what we're doing, and now it's become justified by the government. So these are things that we find because of the relative morals that exist in the society, and because there's nothing to kind of put them back into balance, we find that society takes different turns. We cannot simply rely on the altruism that's supposed to be present in the average individual to somehow bring everyone back to some kind of state of equilibrium. We have to go above and beyond that. That's why the teachings of the Prophet are actually more relevant to today, perhaps, than they've been in any other time in the history. Or perhaps it's always been, to an extent, very great extent, relevant throughout history. So it's important to understand this is not just for Muslims. Particularly because we're going to focus on certain type of prophetic wisdom in this class. It's not just for Muslims. Non-Muslims are equally in need of the same type of advice, the same kind of teachings, because of the effect that it can have on them and the effect that it can have on the entire society at large, inshallah. I didn't explain my question policy, by the way. So the question policy that we have is after every slide I will take time for questions. We're going to limit our questions to 3. And please phrase your question in the form of a question, and please limit your question to 20 seconds maximum. Otherwise it can turn into perhaps a khutbah or a lecture or something like that. So are there any questions on the previous slide? Introduction to hadith. So what is hadith? The definition of a hadith, and by the way, you see the way that it's written. Let me explain a thing or two about that. In the book or in the notes that you have, there's something called the transliteration table. Okay? The transliteration table, or the word transliteration, is different from the word translation. Transliteration is a way of defining or deciding to use certain characters to represent certain characters in another language for the sake of precision. For the sake of precision. So for example, if you look at the letter ha is with an H. And if you look at the letter ha with a little bit more breath, the ha, this one is with an H and a dot underneath it. That's where we have hadith. What's the difference between the two? If we wrote them both with the letter H, if you had not returned back to the original Arabic, you would not be able to reconstruct what the original Arabic was. It could be a ha, the one you write with the two circles there, or it could have been the ha, like that. Which one would it be? So this is a system that's used quite frequently nowadays when you're referring to foreign terms in your own language. Now, is it a perfect system? No, it's not. Unfortunately, the system that we're using is the general standard academic system that's used in most universities. Is it a perfect system? No. It's not a perfect system. There are some flaws in the system, unfortunately, because How do I explain why? I'll explain it to you right now. The word hadith, there's a problem in the system because the TH represents the sound tha. Right? Tha is represented as TH. The problem is you could actually think that the T represents a ta and the H represents a ha and you have a sound of taha. Understand? This is a problem in the system. Some transliteration systems have solved this by underlining the TH. So it's very clear that this is one letter, it's not two separate letters. But we're going to go ahead and use this anyways because it's a pretty good standard, and rather than trying to redefine what the standard is, this will help you to be able to read other academic writings and other Islamic writings which use the same kind of standardized transliteration table. And it varies on which language you're coming from. So the Encyclopedia of Islam, this is important because if you don't know transliteration, you can't access certain materials. The Encyclopedia of Islam, for example, it's a European compilation, very nice. It's been compiled for about over 80 years. Very good reference work, extremely biased reference work as well, but it's still a nice reference work for specialists. If you were to look up the word Jannah in the Encyclopedia of Islam and you turn to J, you're not going to find it. If you go and you look up the word jinn and you go to J and you look it up, you're not going to find it. If you're trying to look up the word jihad and you're just going and you say, well, they must write something, they're not writing anything about anything. Well, that's because the letter J, Jim, is actually in D and J. So you have to go to the letter D to get to the letter J. Why did they do that? They did it because Europeans have different ways of pronouncing certain letters. So people who speak like, Bosanski, or people who speak French, or people who speak German, the way they transliterate their own sounds and pronunciation in their own language is different from the way we do it in English. That's why they tried to make a standardization. Right? So just so that you understand what is transliteration, why is it somewhat important, we're going to try to utilize standardized transliteration throughout all of our courses here at CIS. Anyways, going back to the topic. Hadith it refers to either a statement or an action or a description about the Prophet ﷺ, about the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So it could be something that he said, some statement that he uttered. Whether or not it's in his capacity as a prophet, it's still considered to be a hadith. So for example, you will find a statement of the Prophet where he said, deeds are based by their intentions. Deeds are judged by their intentions. That's a statement. An action of the Prophet. The Prophet, traveled to this area at this time of the day. An action, right? There's an authentic hadith, very highly, rigorously authenticated hadith, which says the Prophet ate chicken. That's it. That's the whole hadith. It's done. Someone saw the Prophet eating chicken. That's great. That's a hadith in and of itself. What does it imply? You go to Islamic law to figure out what that actually means. And what is the implication of that? What is that supposed to mean? Why is it important that this was even preserved authentically with a chain of narration going back? What's the point of it? There's a reason for it. So, and then you find a description about the Prophet. This could be a description of something in his body, like his hair. He used to comb his hair this way and he used to part it at this point in time. He used to wear certain sandals and he used to wear his sandals in this particular way. Any one of these things that's being described is called a hadith. Statement, an action, or a description of the Prophet. Some scholars continue and they go and put more categories out there. This is, I think, sufficient to explain most of the categories that are needed to be explained. When we talk about the plural of hadith, unfortunately in academic environment, there's so many conflicting ways of trying to understand. Do you use the capital H for hadith and the lowercase h for hadith to represent a single one for lowercase and a capital one represents plural? You'll find that in some articles. You'll find that in quite a standard usage. Sometimes you write the word ahadith, which means plural. You don't need to know all this, but this is supplementary. You're not going to be tested on this. And sometimes you'll find people just write the word hadith and put an S at the end. It becomes hadith, or however you pronounce it at the end. It works in writing. So all of these things we're gonna fluctuate back and forth between some of these terminologies. So understand that all of the statements and actions and descriptions about the Prophet has been transmitted and compiled in books known as the books of hadith. Okay, this is important. They've been transmitted and they've been compiled in books known as books of hadith. What is the actual hadith? It is an eyewitness report of someone who was around the Prophet, who had become a Muslim as well, and they're reporting that I either heard the Prophet say this, I saw the Prophet do this, or I saw that the Prophet was like this. Something like that. That is an eyewitness report. And whenever you find it in a book, you're going to find a chain of narration going back, saying that this person said, I heard from this person, who heard from this person, who heard from the eyewitness. And if the eyewitness is not there, then, generally it's not considered a hadith, although there are some, exceptions to the rule and everything, which we'll cover in a future class next year, which is the prophetic wisdom too. So hopefully that part is clear until now. Oftentimes the word hadith is being translated as tradition. And I know some Muslim scholars, they also accept this and they say there's a tradition of the Prophet which said this and this and this. The issue that I have, and I could be corrected if I'm wrong, the issue that I have with the word tradition is problematic because a tradition implies something that you blindly follow, you don't really think about it, it's something that's just been inherited to you. So generally our perception of the word tradition, maybe it's not the classical understanding, but the word tradition means something you just follow. Now what does Islam teach? Islam teaches that we don't blindly follow our ancestors. It says, how many verses in the Quran? People said, we follow what we were, what our grandparents were following before. And it says, what? Even if they had no sense, you're blindly going to follow them? We're not supposed to blindly follow our ancestors. So the connotation that the translation of hadith, when you translate it as tradition, seems to imply, is something that was just kind of handed down and everyone just took it. It becomes a cultural thing. And I think it's better to avoid those kind of things. So maybe a translation like prophetic report or something along those lines actually works a lot better. I recommend that it's better to avoid use of the word tradition. Although if it's being used not in that sense, khair, it's something that's being used. Famous compilations. Okay, so what are some of the famous compilations of hadith that we find among Muslims? There are several. There's that of Imam al-Bukhari. They're generally named after their author, and we'll talk more in detail about them. One is named after Imam Bukhari, al-Bukhari, most people know that. Muslim, the Imam Muslim, he was one of the other people who compiled something. At-Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, An-Nasa'i, Ahmad, all of the different names of people are generally referring to different compilations of hadith that they had at that time. But what's really important and interesting to know is that most of these compilations have some kind of order and some kind of categorization that exists within their book. How were they categorized? Did the Prophet actually go and tell his followers that, look, here's a statement of mine, actions are by intentions, and then another one, take care of your neighbors, and another one, don't exaggerate in religious matters, and another one, and he says, you know what, you should classify this in this place, you should classify this in this place? No. So the Prophet did not specify what kind of categorization should be used in documenting or in preserving his statements. They were simply statements that were made and things that were observed by other people, by his followers. These are not random people, by the way, by his followers. Most of the compilations that we have are classified according to the chapters and headings of Islamic law, of Sharia or fiqh. So generally there's going to be a chapter on purification, there's a chapter on prayer, there's a chapter on fasting, there's a chapter on pilgrimage, on hajj, the chapter on marriage, there's a chapter on divorce, there's a chapter on economic transactions, there's a chapter on battles and war, political situation, all of these kind of chapters that exist. So why is that? And it's important to understand why that is when we try to develop the methodology with which we're going to use to study these prophetic reports. The reason that is because most of these were compiled and organized in around the 3rd century. This does not mean that there was no hadith before the 3rd century, as some people falsely come to the conclusion. It means that the main compilations that we're using, like the updated and revised textbooks, became really popular. The ones that we still use today are the ones that were compiled in the 3rd century. And in the 3rd century, what we find is that Islamic law was a very prevalent and a very popular subject. And people were really focusing on this, and therefore they decided to categorize their compilations primarily according to Islamic law. Okay? Now, why do you need to know that? Why is this even important? Right? It's important because there's a common trend. There's a common trend in the Muslim society where they say we want to go back and we want to make sure that we only go to the most authentic books and the most authentic compilations of hadith, so that we know what we're getting is the right stuff. We're not getting some, shady stuff or unauthentic things or something like that. That sentiment is very legitimate. That sentiment is very legitimate, right? Because you want to differentiate between what is culture and what is Islam, between what someone is fabricated and what someone is really taught what is actually Islam. But there's a problem that comes with that. And the problem that comes with that is people generally hear that the most authentic compilation or the highest standards by someone like Imam Bukhari, someone like Imam Muslim. And all the hadith are considered to be the most authentic that we have. Therefore, there's two problems. Either one, I'm only going to accept from Bukhari and Muslim. I'm not going to accept from any other compilation. Even though not realizing that there are other reports and other hadith in other books outside of Bukhari and Muslim, which are either equally or more authentic than the ones inside Bukhari and Muslim. Perhaps not the whole book, but individual accounts and individual reports. That's one issue. The second issue is, if you try to approach a book like Bukhari or a book like Muslim or a book like Tirmidhi, and you just pick it up and you say, this is what I'm going to read, and it's categorized according to Islamic law, what are you going to find? You're going to find yourself a little bit confused sometimes. You're going to find yourself thrown off a little bit sometimes, thinking that this is kind of weird. If you don't know anything else, I wanted to know, what the Prophet's teachings are generally. Okay, there's thousands of hadith in each of these compilations. You're generally not going to get that far until you start forming certain opinions. And because you started with the framework of Islamic law, your framework that you're forming in your mind is going to be very legally intense. Does that make sense? Very focused on legality, because it's been framed that way, generally by the authors, and they've been categorized, the reports have been categorized from that perspective. Why did they do that? As I said before, that was their specialty. That was something that was very popular at the time. That was something that was important. Now here's the thing. What many people don't realize is people like Imam Bukhari, they did not only compile one book, they compiled separate books. They compiled other books as well. And these books were meant to be a little bit more for the average person, a little bit more for other people. So for example, another book that Imam al-Bukhari compiled was called Al-Adab al-Mufrad. And that's another book he compiled which means, excellent character, right? Or unique, excellently unique, character or behavior or manners or something like that. That was designed for the average person. If you look at the difference between a compilation which has been designed with Islamic law as a framework and one which has been designed for morals and characters and behavior or something like that, you see the difference between the two. And there are several other books. I'm just picking a few of them that kind of are popular throughout history. Another one is called At-Targhib wa Tarhib by Imam al-Munziri. Another one he compiled for the average person, because it's very difficult for them to approach, other books which are organized in different ways. Riyadul Salihin by Imam Nawawi is another one, very famous among Muslims. Another more modern one, which is nice as well, is Tahdhib al-Akhlaq by Abdul Hayy al-Hasani, who is the father of Sheikh Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi, for those of you who know him, one of the great scholars as well. So these are other books which were compiled. This is important because when we understand what was the methodology that was used in compiling a certain book, we can see, is that the best book for us to go and approach? And is that the best way to go and approach that book? Are we going to be a little bit lost? Are we going to get a little bit confused? Because we don't want to. You go to the teachings of the Prophet to get guidance, not to get confusion. But if you go to the wrong book, or if you approach it in the wrong way, or without a teacher, or without knowing what the background is, many people become confused. And if you ever wondered why are people becoming confused when they try to go seek the prophetic wisdom or the prophetic teachings, it's because they didn't understand this background. That's why it's important to understand this background. And the reason why, again, I'm focusing on this, many people said, well, why are you teaching these few ahadith? Why can't we just study Bukhari? Why you got to choose these hadiths from this class? Why can't we just focus on, why don't you just choose the most authentic one, Bukhari? First of all, it doesn't mean it's the most authentic one, number one. Number two, there's a selection criteria you have to use. There's a methodology that needs to be there in order for us to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it and all of these things. So there's another book or another approach which is important, and every time period has different approach, has different things which are important for them because circumstances change. People, there are issues within a society that are going to be more focused upon. If you live in a place where there is occupation, political occupation, if you live in a place where there's constant warfare, the teachings of the Prophet that you would want to focus on in the beginning, or you would want to at least have a good exposure to, would be something about fighting or resisting against oppression, or resisting an oppressor, or something like that. You wouldn't want to focus only on something which, if you're completely in peacetime, there are no political issues or anything like that, you focus on this other aspect or this other aspect. Everyone has beautiful character, everyone is excellent to their neighbors. Maybe that's not the best starting point. So in our society, what are some of the things, I'm talking about America or the West, America in particular. Even though this is going to be internationally broadcasted next quarter, other people around the world will be seeing it. We're focusing, let's say, on America. What are some of the things that you would think from the teachings of the Prophet that we should actually be focusing on because of our context, that perhaps it would have been different had we lived in different circumstances? Relationships between people, families, for people in general. Relationships are in jeopardy, right? There's a major issue when it comes to relationships, family relationships, parental, same thing, marriage relationships, all of these relationships, it's a very important thing. So, Jazakumullah khair, yes. Civil rights, racism, right? This is still a major issue, despite the fact that, sometimes we're taught that, it's a thing of the past. It's something that still exists. So it's something that we need to focus on as well, yes. Women's rights and equality, right? So women's rights and what status do women actually have? It's an important topic as well. It's an important topic because sometimes in our society things are being abused, and it's an important topic. Even if things are okay, there's propaganda coming and telling you that Islam teaches women like this or women like that. So it's an important thing as well. Yeah. Rules for economic transactions, very important, right? That actually falls in the field of Islamic law, but you're right, contextually. Why? Because the way that we process economic transactions today compared to what it was in the past radically changed, right? People bet on a bet of an investment, right? If you look at stock market, for example, right? The things that you can do, you can buy a stock, which usually didn't exist in the past, which is part of a company. Okay, you can sell a stock short that you don't own in the first place. So you just sold something that you don't own. You can get an option on a stock, which means you're betting that this is going to either go up or it's going to go down. And so if something goes down, you actually benefit. And most of these transactions didn't exist at that time. You take, CDO, for example, the housing crisis and everything. People go and they buy a house that they can't afford, and they take a loan out. Now what do? They say, well, the rating of your loan is going to be lumped up, is going to be having a rating. We take your loan, we lump a bunch of them together, and then we take the ratings that we have on this and we rate the entire group of things that we have together. And we go ahead on top of that and we sell that to another insurance company. And the insurance company says, well, if everything's fine, then we're going to be fine. If this guy goes down, then we're going to go ahead and bet on the other side, hoping that it's not going to go up or it's not going to go down. It gets very, very complex. So it's very important that we focus on some of these teachings, but that's going to be a separate topic of Islamic law. But in terms of morals, characters, all of that, what else do we have? Anything else? Yeah. Life insurance. Yeah, a life insurance. Oh, that's still more on the Islamic law side. Living as a minority, right? Living as a minority is different than living as a majority. It makes a world of difference in the way, in the teachings that you're taught how to express yourself, how to deal with people when you're living as a minority. And when was the Prophet living as a minority? Makkah period. Now, Makkah, first 13 years, the Meccan period. So the hadith and the statements and the things and the description about how he acted with other people during the Meccan period, first 13 years, is going to be very relevant to people who are living as Muslims as a minority. So that makes a big difference as well. Okay, so this is why we have context. This is why we have another understanding of things. Okay, let's move on. Did I ask for questions? I didn't. Any questions on this previous slide? Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, the thing is, it's the scholars can't really debate over what is relevant and what's not relevant unless they're in a particular society. If they're scholars in a particular community, yeah, there are things that they will discuss and say, like, for example, when it comes to law, Islamic law, for example, certain penalties and punishments, for example, are not relevant as a Muslim minority because you can't enforce them anyways. So what's the point of looking at the details and how you figure out the evidence for this? It's relevant in explaining people who have misconceptions, but in terms of application, it's not that relevant. Right? So those kind of things, they do exist. They do exist. Okay? Any other questions? The other books by Bukhari, for example, Adab al-Mufrad. Yeah, I suggest this is like you could say this is your supplementary reading. This is your optional reading. Basically, these are really good books. But remember this one thing. This is not a general principle, but the more modern the book that's been compiled, generally, the more we're going to be able to relate to it and understand it. It's the same content. It's not like the content is there. This is the statement that the Prophet made 1400 years ago. But the selection that's being used generally is, you can't always say the more modern one, but the person who compiled the book, the circumstances in which they live, when it matches the circumstances in which you live, the more relevant it will be to you. There may be certain times where a scholar in a certain period of time, he understood the issues better than anyone understood it today. And therefore that book is actually the most relevant. And there's a degree of relativism, what is relevant and what is most important. We have to make certain judgments today, certain judgment calls, yes. The theme, yes, they do have a specific theme. In fact, I'm going to explain what the methodology is when we select it, inshallah. So I'll explain what that is. Okay, let's moving on. So dangers in quoting hadiths. Okay, what are some of the dangers in quoting hadith? The reason why I'm bringing this up is because Muslims quote a lot of hadith, right? And that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's great. If you memorize the verse of the Quran and you're talking and you're conveying it to somebody else, you're quoting it. If you memorize the hadith and you're trying to convey the meaning to somebody else, you're quoting it from memory, you're conveying it. But there are some dangers that we face in society that's happening today, that we find that the situation is getting worse because of the way in which certain hadith are being quoted. And that's why I think it's important to dwell on this. So, some of the misunderstandings, okay, when it comes to quoting hadith, some of the misunderstandings result from one of three things. The first thing is misquoting the actual report itself. Misquoting the hadith itself. Right? Now what does that mean, misquoting the hadith? Meaning that you thought the wording of the hadith was going to be like this, that the Prophet did such and such, but you missed or you twisted or you messed up some important part because of whatever reason. Why would this happen? It happened because sometimes when you hear the person you were learning from, right? You hear something. The person said one thing, you hear something a little bit different. And you remember the thing that you heard, you thought you heard, and you start conveying it to other people. Right? This is something that happens. It's something that happens. Right? It's something to be very cautious about. I'll give you one example. One example was, this is not about a hadith, but it's something that someone thought they heard and they misunderstood it. So there was someone giving a class on Islamic law. And the person was explaining and they were saying that, if we accept this and this reasoning, then catfish would also be unlawful, because if you're not supposed to eat cats, and catfish resembles a cat, then therefore you're not supposed to eat catfish either. So somebody actually took it, and because the reason why this, because the seal is known as the dog of the sea. And if you're not allowed to eat dogs in Islam, the scholars began to question, are you allowed to eat kalb al-bahr, the dog of the sea, or khinzirul bahr, what's known as the pig of the sea. That's just in language. But some scholars said, well, because it's referred to as a pig, you shouldn't be eating it either, even if it's the pig of the sea. That's just the term that they gave it. So the scholar was trying to explain and saying, well, then if you said that cats are not allowed to eat, then you wouldn't be allowed to eat catfish either. So the person actually thought that, the person had said that we're not allowed to eat catfish. And they happened to eat, maybe they were eating catfish at home or something like that. So sometimes you may think you hear something, but you actually hear it incorrectly. And this happens to a lot of people. This is a problem and a danger in quoting hadith, that we find someone misunderstood what they thought that they heard. This is extremely easy to correct, right? How is it easy to correct? Because generally in many Muslim community, in our Muslim community, for even as diverse as it is, there are certain hadith that people generally tend to know or tend to quote in like a party. The Prophet said this, or the Prophet did this, or something. This is very common, right? You'll find certain ones talking, the Prophet said, say Bismillah and you're allowed to eat this thing. Or the Prophet, he used to, help his wife inside the house, and therefore, you lazy husband, you better be helping me as well. There's reasons why we do it, but there are certain hadith which are quite prevalent in one particular community. And in fact, scholars used to write certain books in the past. They said these are the commonly quoted hadith in our community, and we want to explain to you which ones of them are authentic, which ones are fabricated, which ones you should not be quoting in the first place. Because every community has certain ones that people quote. This is very easy to correct by simply teaching people or documenting the hadith in a certain book or in a certain text that people generally tend to know or tend to quote or something like that, and teach it to them. So they have an easy reference. So someone reads this hadith, someone tries to quote something wrong to you, say, actually we studied that one, and look, I got a little book right here and I can check it for you, you misquoted it. This is the way it should be quoted. You misunderstood the hadith. That's the easiest one to fix. I think it's quite easy to fix. The second one is a little bit more difficult. And that is that there is no context given to the hadith, or there's a wrong spin. So the hadith is spin a little bit, like news media spins kind of things. People spin the hadith a little bit differently. So I'll give you some examples. Some examples are, there's a hadith where the Prophet, peace be upon him, this is spin by non-Muslims, by the way, generally, and some, you could say, politically extreme Muslims, where the Prophet said, I have been ordered to fight the people until they say, La ilaha illallah. I've been commanded to fight people until they say that there is no deity worthy of worship, there's no one worthy of worship except Allah. Now, people quote this hadith thinking that, well, the context of the hadith means that Islam has to be forcefully put on everyone. The Prophet's job was to go and fight every single person until they actually accept Islam, or until they say La ilaha illallah outwardly or whatever, hypocritically or whatever it may be. Yet when you actually look at the context of the hadith, that's not the context. And if you just look at basically the life of the Prophet, he was meeting people who did not do that, and he was not fighting them. So I said, what happened? Did he not follow his own teachings? No. This is an easy one to correct, but the thing is, some people may quote it out of context. And they say, see, this Islam is about force or something like that. Another hadith which is quoted out of context is the one I mentioned to you, about saying Bismillah and eat. How many of you have heard this hadith before? You say Bismillah and you eat, right? So why is this hadith quoted out of context? Many people think that the actual hadith is saying that when you have some food in front of you, of which you know it's not allowed for you to eat it, if you say Bismillah on it, it's okay for you to now start eating it, right? That's what many people quote this hadith in front of them, and people have a sense of, if you say Bismillah, meaning in the name of Allah, to eat, and you eat it, all of a sudden it transforms itself into being perfectly fine. It's just okay now. But that's not the context of the hadith. Another part of the understanding of the same hadith is, and this is not about the whole taking a stance on the eating outside and all that. Understand, I'm just talking about the hadith here. The hadith, the second way of quoting this hadith is that we take, this, many people think this refers to whether or not you're allowed to eat the meat of Jews and Christians. Right? And there's that whole argument on whether you can eat their meat, who's defined as a Christian, is it defined as a Christian state, or is it defined as a Christian individual who's slaughtering your meat and all of that? Because we have dietary requirements, and there's certain ways of slaughtering the animal and all of that. Many people think that this hadith is talking about, if a Jew or if a Christian slaughtered your animal or something like that, then when you say Bismillah on top of it, it's going to be somehow okay to eat, or it's going to, if somebody forgot, a Muslim is slaughtering and they forgot to say Bismillah, or they didn't say Bismillah for whatever reason, then you go ahead and say Bismillah. Your statement Bismillah, meaning in the name of Allah, suffices for the fact that the other person skipped it. And yours takes precedence and kind of fills in the gap for the person who didn't say it. And therefore now the meat is as if it was said at the time of slaughtering. But that's not the context of the hadith. That's not the context of hadith at all. Why? It's an authentic hadith, but Aisha was the one who was narrating the hadith, and what did she say? She said this referred to a group of people who newly entered into Islam. Which means what? Which means that they were Muslims. Right? All the other contexts which I've just talked about, misconceptions that they have, is kind of put aside. Why? Because she's talking about Muslims. She's not talking about non-Muslims. So that, getting the rest of the hadith will contextualize it for you. Now there's still a debate on fiqh, how to understand that and what happens and all of that. That's another issue. The issue is we shouldn't misunderstand what the actual context of the hadith was. The last one, I'll give you an example. Many people have heard that it's the recommended practice to eat 1/3, to drink 1/3, and to leave 1/3 for space to breathe. Right? How many of you have heard this? Raise your hand. Right? How many of you have heard that it's sunnah to do this? Raise your hand. Like sunnah means a prophetic teaching to do this. Okay, here's the thing. That's not the context of the hadith. Because we don't know the whole hadith. What is the whole hadith? Says the Prophet ﷺ said, مَا مَلَا آدَمِيٌّ وِعَانْ شَرٌ مِّن بَطْنٍ, that a human being cannot fill anything worse than their own stomach. Not fill any container worse than their own stomach. He said, بِحَسْبِ ابْنِ آدَمْ أَكَلَاتٌ يُقِمْنَ الصُّلْبَةِ. It is sufficient for the son of Adam, meaning a human being, to eat meals which keep his back up straight. What does that mean? That means that it's sufficient for you to eat small meals which are just enough for you to stay healthy. It's the nutrition and the health that you need to keep your back up straight, meaning to function as a person. That is the sunnah, because that's what the Prophet was saying. That's what's required. And then he said, فَإِنْ كَانَ لَا مَحَالَةَ, if you're not able to do that, if you can't handle that part right here, then go with this bare minimum prescription, because you couldn't do that. فَثُلُثٌ لِطَعَامِي, with 1/3 and 1/3 and then 1/3 for space to breathe. There's a difference between saying that this is what the Prophet prescribed, and this is what the Prophet prescribed, but he said if you can't handle that, then you go ahead and do this. There's a difference, right? If you understand the entire thing. So that's something about hadith, that they can be taken out of context or given a wrong spin. In this one, it's not such a major issue, because it's still kind of like a secondary prescription. It's okay to do this. But if you take the wrong hadith and you spin it the wrong way, it can have drastic consequences. So it's very important. The third danger, and then we'll take a break. The third danger in quoting hadiths are confining the hadith that you know, that you read, or that you quote only to specific topics. Only to specific topics. Now what does that mean? I feel that this is quite a danger. I wrote in the book that it's one of the most dangerous ones. Perhaps it's not really the most dangerous one, but it's dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Because people tend to formulate what they think Islam is based upon their own limited knowledge. Right? Based upon their own limited knowledge. So for example, if the first 1,000 hadith that they happen to come across in their life were all related to warfare, and that's what they were taught, what are they going to think about the mission and the message of the Prophet? They're going to think it's all about warfare or something like that. Right? If the first 1,000 hadith that they come across happen to be about prayer, just about prayer, what are they going to think Islam is all about generally? Just prayer, nothing else. You don't have to, greet people. You don't have to smile to people. There's no character. There's no other. People will form an opinion based upon the things that are presented to them. And the problem with that is it's like having an unbalanced diet. Right? It's like having an unbalanced diet. If you hear that, what's a food that's good for you? What's a food that's proven to be very healthy for you? Yes? What? Kale. Kale. Very healthy, right? Imagine now you don't eat anything but kale. That's all you start eating. You don't eat anything but that. Is that going to result in a good, proper, balanced diet? No, it's not. There are people who said, oh, I'm going to go on the Atkins diet and I'm going to give up, carbs and all of that. And they just eat meat, completely just eating meat. I know a few people who did this. What ended up happening to them? They got constipation because they didn't have fiber in their diet, right? And the things weren't moving forward and they weren't getting enough fluids or whatever it was. Things can happen like this if you don't have a proper balanced diet. The same thing in hadith. You have to have a balanced diet of the different topics and the different teachings that the Prophet ﷺ taught. The same thing applies with subjects. If you only take Islamic law, and that's all you study, you think everything's legalistic in nature. If you only take spirituality and you don't take anything else, it's all about the intention. It doesn't matter how you do it. It's all about what's inside your heart. If you take another class and something else, you'll think, oh, it's that. Because we formulate ideas that way. That's the way the human being is. It's like the blind man and the elephant example, right? You got a few blind men, they're touching the elephant. One of them is saying, what is this giant thing? One of them's touching the trunk and saying, no, you don't know what an elephant is. I'm telling you, an elephant is like this. This is how you describe an elephant. And one is touching the tail and saying, no, you got it all wrong. An elephant is this. This is the way it is. The thing is because they were blind, they couldn't see the entire elephant. Right? So it's the same thing when it comes to hadith. We be careful. And the final example that I give is imagine that somebody was in the company of the Prophet ﷺ for a very long time, and now someone says, describe to me how the Prophet was. Explain to me what is his teaching, explain to me all these things. And you start describing, his shoes, or you start describing the way he used to eat food, and you go on and on and on for days upon days just describing certain things about him. Would it give you a clearer picture about what his message was? No, it wouldn't. That's why when we get so, this is just a reminder. When we have to study hadith. But if you don't study hadith in the right way, and there's somebody who studies 100 hadith in diverse topics, and another person who studies 1,000 hadith and has them memorized and can quote them on one particular topic, who has a generally more balanced understanding of Islam would actually be the first person. I'm not saying exactly this, right? It depends on how they study, what other things they're studying and everything, but you get the point. You get the point, inshallah ta'ala. And we're going to have to break for Asr. Are there any questions on this? Yes, you're right. The translation it plays a role. Yes, Jazakumullah khair. That's another point, mistranslation. I'm talking about just Arabic, but you're right. Today we have another problem, is mistranslation. Jazakumullah khair. Any other questions? Okay, inshallah, we're going to break for 10 minutes. Asr prayer is at 3:30, which is in 5 minutes. So if you need to make wudu or whatever, you can go ahead and do that. And we will resume after the Asr prayer. So perhaps the break will be maybe going at about 15 minutes for this class, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.